So this kind of inseparable connectedness, I'm trying to find ways in English to speak about experientially. And I wonder, why are we, I mean, basically our life is a kind of self-referential, comparative conceptuality, conceptual perception. Comparative, conceptual perception. And a self-referencing comparative, conceptual perception. And it's, it's a way of functioning. We've got a whole civilization based on it. But it's also like kind of digging us a grave, separating us from inseparability. And so sometimes I think, geez, why do, as I started to say, why do we get so stuck in conceptuality? So what is conceptuality? It's comparison. It's naming. It's separation. And it's out there-ness. I suppose maybe I should just talk about Zazen more directly or something like that, or that. But I think in all these years I've been doing this, if we don't get out of conceptuality, your practice is always on the surface of things. So we need to have enough evolved attentionality to notice our reference points as we're functioning. To notice, for instance, when when our reference point is we're functioning from a self-referential way of being, a comparative way of being, an outsideness. Those are reference points. Outsideness is a reference point. So if you haven't developed enough stillness in your sitting to notice referentiality and reference points, it's very difficult to practice. Now, so what I'm also speaking about implied here is trying to make a distinction between agency and self. And of course, agency, everything is, your breathing, your autonomic nervous system is mostly agency. We have some access to our heartbeat, which is part of our autonomic nervous system. We have some aspect to our a lot of access to our breathing. And breathing is this territory between the autonomic nervous system and intentionality or consciousness. So when you're bringing attention to breathing, you're exploring the relationship between the autonomic nervous system, which is just doing things on its own. It's all agency. Not only connects the heartbeat, it connects the pressure the heart's making and so forth. So you're exploring that relationship between the autonomic nervous system and intentionality or consciousness. And of course, as you know, not just the generalization of the breath, but the actual physical sensations of the exhale and the actual physical sensations of the inhale. What are you doing when you're doing that? You're teaching, you're educating, you're giving a college degree, a BHD, a breadth degree, to breathing. So breathing begins to penetrate the activity of the body. So you're bringing attentionality to the physicality of the body as it is changing. So you're entering into the time and maybe I will say timelessness of the body. Because I'm also speaking about here is what in our Buddhist tradition is called the immovable body. What the heck does that mean? So I'm going to try to say something about the immovable body. So you're teaching, you're educating the breath just because someone mentioned to you, hey, bring attention to, don't count your breaths, just that's a way to get started. I mean, you spend quite a bit of time counting to 1 or counting to 3, but eventually you get so you can count to 100 or 10, or 10's enough usually, you go back. So you're beginning to harness the attentionality and giving the attentionality a certain kind of spread. And then at some point, breathing breathes itself. And you really feel there's no need to bring attention to the breathing anymore because breathing is breathing itself within attentionality. And when that happens and you really are continuing to practice enough that it can become your embodiment, there's no moment in which attentionality and breath is not connected. This is a little hard to get the swing of. That's why we have monasteries and places where we practice together. It doesn't happen overnight. It's a craft. But eventually, breathing breathes itself and stays within the field and articulates the field of attentionality and makes then noticing without thinking about it much easier. Because you're in the field of attentionality all the time because you've given your breath a BHD. In attentionality. Now, what I just said is just what our practice is. But unless you're located in attentionality, it's not your practice because you forget about it. You go back to comparison and outsideness and out-there-ness and self-referencing. So it kind of sinks under the surface of your activity, hidden under consciousness. Now, we've been practicing self-referencing, comparative, conceptual perception all our life. It's the way we know the world and know ourselves and know our friends. It's the way we love others. It is our life. How do we kind of peel the shell off that? And it happens throughout the body. It's not something, now I've had some insights and, I can be a teacher or something like that, or I understand Buddhism. Okay. Now, I have my occasional, I never ever used to do this, but the last few years I sometimes do this. I have my crib sheets. That's what are they called in German? I don't know. This is about Baudelaire. This is about the immovable body. Now let me give you a sense here, though. Everything is always, here's this mountain we have, our friend. 2 billion years old as far as we know, can calculate. So here we are, our friend. And it stays in place. But it's changing every day. Every day it's different. The clouds, the foliage, the insects, it's simultaneously staying and simultaneously changing. So that doesn't prove anything, but it supports our practice, because our practice also is a kind of stillness and motion. Now, it's assumed in Buddhism, and this concept of the immovable body, that you develop a stillness, like I said, breath is always breathing itself with an attentionality in the midst of your activity. That's a kind of stillness. And you begin to have a bodily stillness. And when in Buddhism they talk about a pearl or a jewel, they mean that stillness in ourselves in the middle of motion, activity, and thinking, which will return us to stillness if we let it. Now, we suffer, we think about this and that, but even the more you have the experience of breathing inseparably part of attentionality, it changes the way in which you suffer. It changes the way in which you think about yourself. It begins to change self-referentiality, because the referentiality is now more agentive or agentivial. They're both actual words. I didn't make them up. I did make them up, and then I found out they existed, actually. So I deserve no credit, but I did make them up first. I thought that there must be a version of this, and I found it. It's true. I think when Buddhism speaks about the immovable body, or as I say sometimes, the mountain body, like our Thai Buddha there, I think what is being spoken about is biological homeostasis. Now, I'm speaking here from a book called The Ocean of Nectar. Nectar is what in a flower attracts a bee or a hummingbird or an insect to get a little nectar and fertilize another flower. So an ocean of nectar is a kind of wonderful idea. It means that we are now attempting in our modest way to generate enough nectar, Buddhist dharmic nectar, to attract the world into practice. So in this book called The Ocean, the lake, the ocean, the river, the ocean of nectar, they are speaking of what's called the eighth ground. And I'll read how it's described. The bodhisattva, let's take that to mean any seeker who decides to practice. taking the precepts is one of the ways you confirm that. The bodhisattva abiding within on the eighth ground. The eighth ground is called the immovable body. They didn't know anything about the limbic system or neurons and things, but they felt something's going on that's complex. So the bodhisattva abiding on the eighth ground, immovable, the immovable body, is free from conceptions. And being free from conception is able to apprehend true existence. Now, this is not just talking into the wind. This is talking to you and me. And such a bodhisattva is free from conceptions, apprehending true existence, and attains 12 qualities. And this is the part where it gets really interesting or uninteresting. Attains 12 qualities equal in number to however many atoms there are in 100,000 of the 3,000 world systems. Well, what do we make of something like that? Attains the 12 qualities. Well, here we can, this is whatever they are, I forget, are accessible to our experience. But we suddenly move into vastness. 100,000, as many atoms as there are in 100,000 of the 3,000 world systems. Well, that's a huge number. But we all know there's more neurons or cells and stuff than there are galaxies, all of those numbers. They are vast, in fact. And they sensed that. They didn't know how to express it. As I say, they didn't have concepts of atoms, but they had concepts of atoms, but they were just particles. So I would say, at least in my experience, they're speaking about biological homeostasis. Because the body is always trying to return itself to an equilibrium, to a homeostatic situation. And that homeostatic situation is monitoring what all of your biological functions. They didn't have neurons or, for example, any concept of a limbic system, but they did have the concept of atoms. For example, when they say a bodhisattva of the eighth ground, the word atoms is used to reflect the particularity and agentivial, I would say, particularity of vastness. They sense something's going on that's so complex and interrelated that we're sort of floating in the middle of that vastness and trying to tune ourselves. And the teaching of Yogic Buddhism is when you try to tune yourselves with conceptuality and an outsideness, you're out of tune. So how do you tune yourself? Well, the first, second, and third, and the seventh grounds, or what the eighth, ninth, and 10th grounds are different. Really, they're descriptions of different ways to tune yourself to this inseparability, which we could say is like biological homeostasis. And that is called the immovable body. And we can enter, a door for us is non-conceptual attentionality.